Welcome to the HC Commodities Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. This podcast is produced by HC Group, a global search firm dedicated to the commodities sector. Today we're talking agricultural professions, the people behind the trade, and that's the title of our guest Jonathan Kingsman's new book. Jonathan has spent the last 3 years interviewing professionals from across the agricultural sector to understand the roles and the disciplines and what it takes to create the agricultural supply chains. Jonathan is an author and blogger on the agri sector and has spent over 37 years of his career in the agricultural supply chain. As always, you can really support the show by leaving us a positive review on the platform you're listening on, or comment on YouTube. And as always, I hope you enjoy the episode. Jonathan, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Yes, and it's been a good couple of years since we had you last on talking about your previous work on the agricultural sector and describing to us the ag houses and their trade. Today we're back talking about your book, soon to be published, Agricultural Professions, the People Behind the Trade, which is obviously quite close to my heart, not only as a subject matter, but also being a grateful participant in it. So let's, I guess, before we talk about some of the learnings and takeaway from the work, it'd be good just to get what led you to writing this book.
Well, at the end of 2021, I fractured my cervicals skiing, and I was paralyzed from the chin down. So it was quite a long recovery process. I had a couple of operations, and during one of my stays in hospital, I was thinking about all the different professionals and the professions that were involved. And as I lay there in intensive care one evening, I counted up to more than 30 of them. And what I enjoyed, what made the stays in hospital bearable, was the interaction with these people and the way that each person had a story to tell, and the importance of each person involved in it. One of the worst moments was one of the stays in hospital. I caught COVID, so I was in isolation for a while, so couldn't talk to anybody, which is a real punishment. So a few months later, I was having lunch with Ivo Savanovic, who you've interviewed many times, or a couple of times
on the show,
yeah. And he was saying that there were more professions in the commodity supply chain, and we counted them, and we ended up with about the same number, 30 plus. So he suggested I write about them. He said that they are unrecognized, they're not really appreciated, and everybody concentrates on traders, but nobody really concentrates or focuses on all the other professions in the supply chain. So this book is different from the other ones because the others looked at the companies that are trading at the commodities and the way that the trading operates, the functions, but this one is really about people. It's about the humans involved in the trade.
Yeah, and it's kind of, I always think about it like an aircraft carrier, right? You might have sort of 20 pilots or something that are actually, at the sharp end, but it takes the other 2,000 of the crew to actually enable that to happen. And I guess also what's quite fascinating as well is how the emphasis on certain roles has changed over time, and also new roles are being created in the wake of technology and energy transition, sustainability and so forth. Keeping it zoomed out at this stage, well, firstly, let's just talk about the book's construction. Can you just give us some sense of how the book is laid out and how you went about writing it?
So it started off as a kind of blog project. I have a blog, commodityconversations.com, where I interview people about their history and their careers and their journeys within the commodity trading sector. And so I carried on doing this and accelerated this, and in total I interviewed over 100 different people, and I have 56 of those in the book. It's different. The book is different from a podcast or a straight interview in the sense that I worked with the people to prepare and to try almost like a biography, of a very short biography, 2,000 words of these people, of these professionals, looking at two sides. First of all, their role, their professional role, but also looking at their humanity, the human side of them, revealing their vulnerabilities, their fears, the challenges they face day to day, all these things that make us human. So that's really how it worked, the structure of the book. So I put it in the book into I think 17 different sectors, and within those sectors, I've looked at the different types of people. For example, the if you look at nurses in the health supply chain, there's so many different types of nurses. If you look at, for example, brokers, I was in broker for many years. There's origin brokers, intertrade brokers, derivative brokers, and destination brokers. So I've tried to include as many subcategories as possible. I understand that the research shows that about 30% of the people working in the agricultural supply chain are women. So my goal was to have 30% of the interviews as women, and I succeeded. It was a bit of a struggle, but I did, so I'm quite pleased with that. So that's really how the structure is. Each section has, I've written a little introduction, adding a little bit of personal touch as well as some of my own experience dealing with that. One of the challenges with this book was that I didn't know much about some of these different professions. For example, I didn't know anything about insurance or compliance or chartering vessels. Or one interview I have is with a lady, a ship captain. I absolutely know nothing about operating and running a ship. So I learned a huge amount about the business through this project. So it took me longer than usual to do. It took me over 3 years to write because there was a lot of research, a lot of work went into it. So I'm really, really happy the way it's worked out.
Fascinating, and I guess this is sort of part of the journey that I've been on as well, just as we discussed for my short chapter in it, about the huge amount of learning that you do by sort of going on this voyage of discovery, but also just the complexity of the different types of roles that actually culminate in these sectors, and to some part as well, and why I think this is a fascinating read, how little knowledge there is and few places you can get that knowledge about all these different roles. And yes, everyone sort of, talks about the trader, but only certain people are actually interested in that role, and only certain people are capable of that role. But there's just a plethora of other really fascinating careers that go around to build what is the agricultural supply chain, and obviously one of the most crucial ones, if not the most crucial one in the world. So a few questions from me. How did you get any sense of, I guess, how these roles have changed over time, and any sense of how certain roles have become more prominent, more important in a world that is deglobalizing, is going through energy transition, and is also digitizing?
Absolutely. So I think there's a few major changes. Most important one is technology and digitalization, but I'll come to that in a minute. But what I wanted to mention was that I think that the world of trading has changed and the way that traders operate has changed. It used to be very much a lone wolf going hunting who would go out and on a sailing ship and go to months away from home, go to an origin, negotiate purchases of commodities, and then the sailing ship would come back. So it was very much a hunting role, and this is very suitable for men who tend to be more hunters than gatherers. But the world of trading has changed. It's become much more teamwork. It's become networking, and it's more of a gathering role than a hunting role. And this is roles that are more suitable for women who can network better, work better in teams, and are less individual. So that's one very positive thing. And we're seeing more traders, more women coming into the business now. And that's really improving things and making things much better. Another thing that's happened is that big change is that the pendulum is swinging back. I've always been sort of emphasize that governments have been getting out of the food business from the 1970s and 80s, and that they were leaving it to free markets. But this move towards food security is meaning more government involvement, and the idea of committees fixing prices and doing deals rather than markets. And that really leads to less efficiency and a step back for me. So that's one thing. But one of the other things is that this government intervention has reduced this transparency of the markets and made them harder to trade. If you think of COFCO's role in imports of beans and other commodities into China, it's difficult for other traders to get information. And if you look at Russia, for example, with their wheat exports, you haven't really got any idea of what's happening there. So this reduced transparency has made the trading role harder. It's also reduced the emphasis on food security has replaced a kind of emphasis on sustainability. So we 2 or 3 years ago, sustainability was it, but now it's really food security, and you take sustainability for granted, but it's kind of taken second fiddle to that. And also you've got this deglobalization of the markets where food is becoming political, governments get involved, less free trade, and that again makes it harder to trade. Just think back to the last Trump presidency when a single tweet from Trump could change everything and completely unpredictable. So those are some of the biggest ones. The biggest ones to come, and they're actually happening is now is the uh, AI, artificial intelligence, and we all made a big fuss about blockchain, but that kind of disappointed in terms of the results. But AI is a game changer. It's completely different, and traders and the whole sector has to embrace it. I was thinking, I used to spend a lot of time as an analyst doing trade flow analysis and trade flow predictions. And I was thinking the other day about how I could use AI, how I would use it now to help me make those trade flow predictions. And it would really make things much easier. And the last one, of course, is digitalization, which is we're moving from emails to platforms and trades and the whole supply chain and the documents, everything else should be on moving to platforms, but then you have a risk of silos developing, individual platforms competing. Um, Not everybody's on the same platform, and it's difficult for a platform to gain critical mass because you have to have everybody on it. So there's a lot of startups out there. I interviewed many of them, not all are in the book, but I'm not sure which ones will win, so I couldn't predict the winner, but that's work in progress.
I mean, there's a lot in there, right? And it'll be kind of fascinating to come back to, in 5 years and what your great book, The New Merchants of Grain, how that story will differ in the wake of all those changes, and just digging into those a little bit because they all weave in with one another, right? But it is fascinating that essentially the story of ag over the last, the 90s, the 2000s, early 2010s was increasing transparency, was a consolidation to these huge houses because the markets were so efficient that they needed all of these asset footprints globally to be able to transact. And that's where that kind of the role of the trader has changed, right? It was certainly much more sort of, you spoke about it, network, but it's tied to a system, and sort of the historical sort of swashbuckling trader has, and this goes across the commodity sector, that scope of action has reduced. But now you face a world where, and Jeff Curry alluded to this in 2 episodes ago, that we are going from kind of that sweeping 80s free market economies, the Hayekian approach, to now the other way, driven by various sort of, I guess, theses around security and so forth, but fundamentally we're going back to a protectionist regime. There's much more market intervention, and that poses a real challenge to how the ag sector has been set up. And there seems to me to be very little conversation within policy making, within governments, about how, and this is age old in the ag sector, right? It really is. Anytime prices shoot up, traders are called into the Senate in the US to explain that actually they have nothing to do with price spikes. This is risk management. But it seems we're going back that way, and that would pose quite a challenge structurally to how the industry has been set up.
Absolutely. And it's quite worrying because with climate change, it's going to be tougher for people to, for markets, for traders to react and for farmers to react and the correct signals to get to the farmers to produce the right things at the right time. So I can understand governments who playing to a domestic audience, for example, India that bans exports of rice, a certain type of rice, but then that pushes up the price for other people in the markets. I started in the business in the late 70s when there were things called commodity agreements, where governments got together under the auspices of the United Nations to try to set a fair price for commodities, a fair price for farmers and for consumers. And all of these commodity agreements failed, and they've been proven to actually increase volatility. So unfortunately, this move to government interference and government intervention is likely to lead to higher prices, higher volatility, and less efficient markets, which is bad timing because what we need is for efficient markets to send the right signals at a time of structural change caused by climate change.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And that does pose, I mean, when you had these conversations, what was and I want to come back to the general mood of the sector at the end of the conversation, but was there a recognition that this is going to be difficult times for the merchants and, talk about like the roles that do engage with governments and with society to try and get that point across?
Absolutely. Just to give you an example for wheat, I was talking to somebody yesterday about the Russian wheat exports, and he was explaining that it's now impossible to trade Russian wheat forward. There's been a consolidation within the exporters. The government has moved in to agriculture exports as a way to control them in the same way they control the oil exports. And this is making it difficult to trade forward much more than a month. So that makes it very tough for markets to be able to adjust ahead of time. And uh, it's more challenging
Yeah.
and harder to trade and less efficient.
And just talking from HC's perspective and the new types of roles that we have been doing, if I contrast this last 5 years to the 5 years before, a lot more a re-emergence and emphasis on research and economists, right? Because the world has become a little bit more opaque. Certainly an emphasis on compliance as governments become more legislation around commodities in the wake of COVID and the price run up in energy prices in Europe and so forth. Also, that sort of governmental relationship role as well. It's just fascinating how 10 years ago, none of the major trading houses leaders, particularly in energy, had really wanted to have any engagement with governments, and now that's a key part of the role, right? So you see this come through in those professions, and likewise, credit control. I mean, the role of a credit officer today is far more complex than it was 10 years ago. Similarly, in risk as well, as we're having sort of, Six Sigma events every 2 seconds. I mean, the models don't apply in a much more volatile world. So, all of that comes through in your book, but also comes through, I guess, onto our desks in terms of the types of roles that we're doing within the ag sector that's going through this evolution.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like a pendulum swing too far, maybe one way. Perhaps the governments got out too much. Maybe they should be a little bit involved in terms of making sure that there's free competition and fair competition. But we're now swinging back too far, I believe, the other way. The other problem, of course, with governments coming back into it is that you open up the business to corruption. If you've got only have private actors, they're interested in the bottom line and the best price, whereas a government bureaucrat who might be very poorly paid in a lowly position is susceptible to a bribe. So unfortunately, we could see this coming back in, which would be very sad to see.
Yeah, yeah, and actually, it's completely to your point. The more transparent markets are, the less room there is for corruption to invade. And you see, sort of, I was reading a book recently on the history of wireless and essentially cell phone bandwidth and so on, and just because that was in the hands of government to sell, the amount of corruption that kicked that industry off. And yeah, it's a very valid point, and more points of danger for the merchants that have established themselves over the last 30, 40, 100 years, now having to go back into, manage that world.
Absolutely. So there's a big brand reputational risk involved in that, because what was acceptable maybe 40 or 50 years ago is not acceptable now. So again, that'll make it some markets impossible for some of the bigger trade houses to be involved in.
The energy and resources sector is experiencing unprecedented change. To help companies navigate this world and capture its opportunities, HC Group launched Enco Insights in 2023. Enco has rapidly become the leading global expert network dedicated to energy and resources. Enco Insights leverages HC Group's 20 years of connections and dedication to the sector to give clients the expertise they need to take decisions fast. Connect with Enco's experts for anything from a 1-hour insights call to a longer-term consulting project at encoinsights.com.
Just to give us some flavours of the interviews there are in the book, and I've found them all fascinating, but are there any that stand out as sort of emblematic of these trends we've been discussing?
Everyone has a story to tell, and that's what's wonderful about humanity. Everybody has a story to tell. You just have to ask the right questions. There was one gentleman I interviewed last year who's not in the book, but I asked him at the end if he had any tell me one thing about him that wasn't on his CV, and he said, well, I can count to 10 in Japanese. And I said, well, that's not very interesting. Tell me something else. And he said, well, actually, I trained as a marine biologist, and I spent the first 10 years of my career tagging whale sharks in South Africa. So we then spent half an hour talking about whales and sharks and what exactly he was doing, and it was a lovely conversation. So it was really trying to eke out these gems from people. One of the nicest or the best interviews I like is with Serge Vassana, who's the president of Sucre, which is a major sugar, coffee and cocoa trader, moved just recently into grains. And Serge is a very keen horse show jumper. And so we spent a lot of time talking about the similarities between show jumping and trading, and the idea that you can't control everything. There's always something that can go wrong, one bar to fall, but there's always another chance, there's another competition. So there's always another trade, and so the similarities between that was fascinating. On a personal point, I got 3 favorite interviews. One is with Luis Carlos de Santos, who's a vessel agent in the port of Santos, and he looks after the vessels and makes sure that the crews change and they're well supplied, etc. But he's a very keen photographer, and what he did was he set up got one of his clients to sponsor him to go to Africa and to teach young kids the art of photography, and one of them is now a photographer and a tracker for the National Geographic, and so that was a lovely story from him. There was another one which was Bia Pupo from Platts, S&P Global, and she really showed her vulnerability by talking about burnout within the sector, the pressure that people are under to perform, and to bring that subject out into the open. And that was a very personal, very touching discussion. But I think my all-out favorite is with Robin Shaw, who's an old friend. He was when I joined the business, he was the big cheese. He was the senior and the most respected and the brightest and the biggest trader in sugar at the time. And he talked about his career. He's 80 now. He talked about this difficulty with addiction, and the difficulty where he was trading like gambling, and that really brought out some of the most difficult, the dark side of the business, how you can get addicted to trading and gambling, and the difference really between trading in terms of gambling or supply chain management. So those were really the three or four that I like the most. More personal stories.
It is actually, and HC Group has partnered with one or two organisations that I guess tackle this welfare side over time. There is some unique qualities, and it's hard for me to say this because I've only really ever been in this sector, albeit from a recruitment angle. But there are some unique aspects that do create that intensity that can create burnout or manifest in addictions or whatever it might be, because in some ways the results are so transparent, right? There's a relatively small balanced scorecard for a trader and a trading company. The rewards are enormous and also, for the most part, quite transparent as well. And, this is a 24-hour business, and the sort of skew towards massive payoff or massive failure, and this is incumbent on all those roles that you've identified and interviewed for, whether it's compliance, whether it's risk, whether it's shipping or whatever it might be. There's just an intense pressure, and ultimately some of it's to do with the fact that there's no brands, right, in commodities. It's all about lowest cost of production, lowest cost of shipping. There's no essentially IP, although AI might start changing that, but there's not a brand or an IP or a product that stands on its own. Every day you're starting off more or less from a blank sheet of paper or a whole series of costs from the assets you've rented or developed. I mean, it's quite a unique sector in that part. And because of those attributes, it does come down to your skill set and ability versus the same seat in another organization. It does have some of the unique qualities.
Absolutely. The pressures are enormous. The rewards are high as well, but the pressures are not just on the traders, they're on the operators as well. I mean, an operator, he has a ship that's delayed, or if it gets to send a document or something, it can cost millions. So that people are constantly under pressure, and there's not really anywhere to hide. And that's one of the things there's no downtime. And that's one of the things that I talked about with Mike Whitney, who's a coach, and he was saying one of the problems in this business is there's no downtime. Other businesses, you get a period of intense activity, but in commodities trading, it's always on. It's 24/7, and that's one of the problems. There's another issue really which is adding to this pressure from the supply chain is the narcotics trade, and that's really an elephant in the room. Is we're getting narcotics traffickers who are hijacking the physical trade. They're putting their drugs into cargoes of sugar or coffee or whatever, and into containers and into the bulk carriers, and it's putting tremendous pressure on those involved. I spoke to a couple of people who aren't in the book, but they're explaining that their families have been threatened, particularly in Brazil. They're under enormous pressure to say either you do this or we're going to kill your family or kill you, and so it's very, very tough. And there's one interview in the book with Jack Marion, who's an importer, sugar importer in Africa, and he had a container that ended up going AWOL, and it ended up in Kenya, and it was full of cocaine, and he spent months in a Kenyan jail. When he's saying that I'm not the drug trafficker, this container is just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it was very, very tough on him. So it's making life harder for this supply chain.
Yeah, fascinating. I hadn't considered that. I mean, there's an episode in that alone, right? And as you say, adding to the extraordinary downside risk of that happening to you on a personal level is terrible.
Yeah.
So and I think that's part of the fascination for me about reading the book, and I hope lots of people go and buy it when it comes out, because I do think it either is a primer to what the industry is if you're considering careers within it, but also actually combining kind of a broader understanding of all of the different roles that come together if you're a professional in the sector already, but also sort of the personalities and the humanities you highlighted behind those different roles, which is like I find that fascinating and part of what drives my career. But I guess, you have been an author and a writer and a blogger on this sector for a long time. We last spoke and we really sort of spoke about the evolution of the trading houses, and that was sort of the really during the height of COVID or just before we had that conversation, I think 21. What is the mood today, and how is the sector faring?
The mood in the market is excellent. Traders always add more value when markets are fragmented and disordered, and this is really what's been happening over the last few years. The situation is very different from 2019 when I wrote New Merchants of Grain, when people were uh, despondent. They were believing that there were no margins anymore in markets, that they were all trying to turn themselves into food companies, build a brand into food businesses because trading wasn't ever going to work again. And that's been completely changed. So the returns are better, the mood is better, but unfortunately, this can lead to complacency. For example, we all know that ag markets are cyclical, and so we should be preparing for the next downturn and be aware that it's going to happen. Everyone believes that the good times will last forever, but ag markets don't work like that. Another problem with this complacency is that ags are lagging in terms of digitalization, IT, artificial intelligence, compared to the other sectors. I know you mentioned that ags are behind compared to metals and the oil trade. So I think we haven't been investing enough into technology and making things more efficient and better. And I think what we need to do is attract fresh blood. We need a younger generation coming into this business. Again, Wally mentioned once to me that we're missing a whole segment of talent within the trade. During that period of 2015, 2020, very few new people came in. The big companies weren't hiring, and so we've got a gap of 30-year-olds that just aren't there. And we'll feel that more and more as we older guys leave, and these people should be moving up. So mood is excellent, but we shouldn't become complacent.
Yeah, and I want to tackle those each by case by case, because I think there's quite a bit in there, and we did talk about that I think in my interview in the book on the people side. Just on that mood, okay, there's lots of volatility, dislocations which the traders are managing. I just sort of get some sense of the future there, because yes, all markets are cyclical, and I imagine that every time you're in a cycle that's at the peak, you're saying this time it's different. There are some sort of differences this time that suggest actually markets might go through a prolonged period of volatility in the wake of climate change, in particular, energy transition and changing demands, but also this swing back to more government interventions. So is there any sense out there that this cycle might last longer, or is there sort of the weather eye on the fact that as much as you might believe that at the time, there's always going to be a return to a more stable market?
Well, normally the cycles work because the prices go up, farmers plant more, and we go into a surplus situations. And so when surplus is around, there's very little volatility, and it takes time to work out off those surpluses until prices go down, and then production drops, etc. This time, you're right. We could see climate change changing that and making it harder for markets to react to make it slow or make it not possible for markets to react. The government intervention, as we mentioned earlier, will make it more volatile as well. So you could be right, but I don't think we can rely on it. I think we've got to say, look, we've got to prepare for a next downturn. We've got to invest in new people and technology. So yes, it may be different this time, but over the last 40 years that I've been in the business, following the business, I've heard that many times.
Yeah. On that capital investment side, we aren't seeing the levels we would normally see. There is a reluctance on the part of investors for investing in biological systems, especially with sort of the volatility around environmental policies and so forth. There are some bright spots, right? We're seeing a lot of investment at the moment into biofuels and so on. But there is sort of a a lag compared to what we would normally see at this time, when all the trading houses are spending lots on facility, on assets and so on, and we're just not really necessarily seeing that. And I think that is due to some concern and volatility about how this sector transforms and manages a more volatile world.
Absolutely. Well, the two main themes and what I call the two Ds is decarbonization and digitalization. And I know that the food sector and the agricultural traders have a huge role to play and a very important, significant role to play, and they can make a real difference in that. Maybe they could do better. I would think I would give them a sort of 12 out of 20 and say you're doing fine, but you can do better. One interview I did was with Jan Dieleman, who's the head of Cargill's shipping department, and Cargill is a massive owner and charterer of vessels, and they are doing a huge amount in terms of decarbonization of the maritime sector. And so that's a sort of leadership that the industry needs, and is an example of leading the sector, instituting change, driving change, which is wonderful to see. But in other sectors, maybe it's a little bit, well, sort of slower.
Mm. And we have actually spoken on that technology piece and historically, and yeah, there is a sense that ultimately by sort of the nature of the markets, right? If you think about the power markets, they're the most intensely digitized. The systems, the complexity around managing those markets means that power traders typically have, are at the vanguard of the platforms and systems that are required, and actually ags are quite far back there. There's quite a lot to do, and frankly, it's going to be hard to capitalize on AI until you've got that piece in place. And there are therefore, the energy traders, I think, we're already seeing this, are eyeing the ag markets as, okay, we might actually have some competitive advantages in those markets from a system standpoint if we can somehow get access to the proprietary data that is required. And actually we're seeing that certainly as well in the hedge fund space. On the people side, and actually our HC Group's Q2 market review, the op-ed piece was all about, even though we don't do junior level recruitment or graduate recruitment, it's obviously, those people are key to us 10, 15 years down the line. The industry as a whole really isn't attracting, or hasn't consistently brought in new classes of people each year. There are these gaps that match the cyclical nature of the sector that's kind of inherent in it. There's also arguably 20 years ago, grads in Minnesota, one of the top jobs you could get was Cargill. And in the wake of sustainability and the rise of banking and fintech and so forth, there's commodity trading has lost its luster compared to what it had 30 years ago. And the sector itself hasn't done a phenomenal job of really advertising itself. It's quite secretive. It's difficult to understand. You even see that in how Wall Street analysts review trading results. There's always a discount to it. And there's something also a little bit more challenging around the ag sector versus the energy sector, where most jobs, for the most part, are in major conurbations, whereas the traditional route into the least trading within ags was that you would go and run a merchandising facility in the sticks somewhere, and that's where you'd cut your teeth before you got to, talking just from a US lens, before you got to Kansas City or you got to New York or you got to Chicago. And with most people, professionals now having partners who are also professional, there is a real challenge about getting people to move to small town America or small town Europe as part of that natural career ladder. So there's quite a challenge there, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've highlighted those very well. It is difficult because you would want to go and Cargill or somebody else would want you to go and run a crushing plant somewhere or a grain silo in the Midwest, and your partner wouldn't want to go because they have their own career. And that's something that came out repeatedly during the conversations that I've had with them, is the difficulty of managing careers within the ag sector with partners and their careers. So taking it in terms, okay, well, next move will be yours, this move will be ours. And quite often, the partners tend to be within the same sort of sector, not the same companies, but involved, so they can have a better understanding of that. Yes, actually, maybe I do need to move to Hungary to run a crushing plant for a while, and this sort of stuff. And it's also interesting that the choices that people have had to make. I spoke to one gentleman who dropped out of the big company ag sector because his daughter was having slight difficulty at school and wanted to go back to Portugal, where she would be back within her own um, culture and her own education system. So the choices that parents particularly face as well in children's education makes it harder for these big companies to move people around every 2 or 3 years as they like to do.
And exactly right. I think the world is becoming more static, as for those reasons you highlighted. But it's also fair to say as well, 5% of your staff are traders who are sufficiently paid where their partner probably doesn't need to work. But the rest of the disciplines highlighted in this book, they're certainly well paid, but they're not lucrative enough to be able to sort of move around the world with abandon, irrespective of your partner's career and abandoning a two income household, right? So it is really a challenge for the sector that inherently requires a global footprint, and within countries needs a regional footprint as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's not just a question of money. It's a question of giving people the opportunity. For example, even if a wife and a mother of a wife of a trader doesn't earn as much, she's entitled to her career just as much as he is. And so it's a question of managing these two career expectations and to try to find sort of compromises. And this puts pressure on marriages and partnerships as well. So that's another issue that came out in the conversations.
Yeah. Well, just before we wrap up, and obviously I'm thrilled to be part of an interviewee in the book, and we will, as you know, I'll post links as soon as we get a publication date for you, and very excited about getting my hands on a hard copy. What's in the future for you, Jonathan? What's the next book?
Well, they always say that the best way to promote a book is to write another one. I've got a few ideas, but I need to find a topic where I can add value. And so I used to write a book a year because it was easy, but now I'm looking to do more research, and this book took 3 years. I expect the next one to take 3 years as well, so I'm slowing down with age. But really my objective is to give back to the sector, because to teach, to provide material that explain how it works, to encourage young people to consider a career in the sector. And that's why I price the books at the lowest price that Amazon allows, so that university students, young graduates, can afford them and don't and can read them. And it's the other reason as well, as I self-publish, because publishing companies tend to put prices up way too high. The first book that I did was called The Sugar Trading Manual, through a publishing company, and they charged about $500 or $600 for it. And so that's no use to anybody. And so that's why I try and keep the prices low. But Paul, I love what I'm doing and love meeting new people, talking to people, keeping in touch. And so I'm not going to give up anytime soon. So another one will be coming out, and I hope to be speaking to you sometime in the future about it.
Yeah, fantastic. And I'll also put links to your blog as well, Commodity Conversations, in the show notes. And, again, from my standpoint, I think taking the people angle, being an advocate for the sector, broadening understanding, and hopefully getting some people excited about the career opportunities in what is a very fascinating sector. Great reward, but also hard work and fulfilling. I think is excellent. So I'm really it's a delight for me to have you back on, and look forward to the next book.
Okay, well, thank you, Paul. As always, it's a pleasure to talk with you. I really admire what you're doing in the terms of the podcast. So keep up the good work, and look forward to talking with you soon.
Thank you for listening. To find out more about HC Group our global offices, and our expertise in search within the commodities sector, please visit www.hcgroup.global.